Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and pick up in the Gospel of John, which we've been going through week after week after week, eating this stuff up. And we're in here's my fun little outline of the Gospel of John. So we're hitting here now. We're getting towards the end. We're in the section that sort of, Jesus shows up at 4 different Jewish holy days, sacred days, and he reveals how he is the fulfillment of those things, the embodiment, the manifestation of the things behind those things. And so we did the Sabbath. Actually, the Sabbath showed up twice in here, if you were paying attention. It was actually last week is when the Sabbath showed up a second time, because there's another Sabbath in between here, between Tabernacles and Hanukkah. I mean, it's Passover, Tabernacles, Hanukkah. And there's this it's this, John keeps the narrative going without really doing what we would generally look for in a normal, Western story, if you're reading a Western novel or whatever, where there's a lot of trying to make sure you know the exact time frame and how much time has passed, and then all of that. It's just he sort of by degrees just brings us in our thematically and in our minds, and then chronologically from Tabernacles to Hanukkah. And that might seem like a weird thing to do unless you know what Hanukkah is about, and it's not the Adam Sandler song, and how Hanukkah originated, and its connection, actually is a connection to Tabernacles. And so it makes perfect sense that he would take us along with Jesus. And it was we're in Tabernacles, and there's all these tabernacle themes going on, and then suddenly it's Hanukkah, and wait, how did we get to Hanukkah? Isn't that a few months later? Yes. But he takes us and shows us the thematic connections and the theological connections without us even realizing it. It's just so fun and brilliant. So quick recap. So at Tabernacles, big themes of the living water that God used to quench the thirst of the Israelites in the wilderness. And then there's this light theme where they light up the giant menorahs in the temple every night that's representing that pillar of fire with which God led the children of Israel through the wilderness. There's water and light themes in Tabernacles. And so Jesus says, yeah, I'm that, and I'm that too. He says, if anyone who's thirsty, he shouts out in a loud voice in the middle, at the end of the feast, if anybody's thirsty, come and drink. I'm actually the water, And then he says, I'm actually the light of the world. Those, giant candles are amazing, but I'm actually the real light, that those things are a pale foreshadowing of. I'm the real thing, right? And so then he goes from that, and that causes some controversy. And then there's this talk about, light and darkness and blindness versus seeing, and who can really see, and what does it mean to really see? And what does it really mean to be blind? And then Jesus heals a man who was born blind, and then that pops up, more pushback, because again, it's just like with the guy who is paralyzed for 38 years. It's on the Sabbath, and so people are like, how can he be from God if he breaks the Sabbath? He can't be from God, but he's doing miracles that nobody's done before. And it's just all the people are split and divided. And we ended last week at the end of John 9. Jesus is saying this thing. He finds the blind man's been cast out by the religious leaders from his local synagogue, and Jesus seeks him out and finds him and reveals himself more fully to this guy, and affirms, as this guy expresses a faith in Jesus as Messiah, now you can really see. I healed your blindness, but now you can really see. And he says that this is verse 39 of chapter 9. For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And so then some of the Pharisees were hanging around, they hear him, and they're like, oh, we get it. You're talking about us, right? You're saying we're the blind ones. And then Jesus says, well, if you were blind, you'd have no guilt. But since you say we see, your guilt remains. So yeah, what you said. You are the blind ones because you're not connecting it. And then it goes straight from that into chapter 10 where it starts with truly, truly, and Jesus is talking. And it's like, wait, is he talking to these Pharisees? Who is he talking to? And John's like, yeah, just go with it. Just go with it. Go along with the ride and see what happens. And so Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, verse 1, chapter 10, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he opens. Or the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them out, all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Because wait a minute, we're talking about blindness and sight, and now suddenly Jesus is using this shepherd, sheepfold, and gate, and like, what does this have to do with anything? With anything, Jesus? It's like, oh. And it's like, and I love that John puts that little commentary, that verse 6 is so helpful for us, because it's like, yeah, you're not tracking? Good, because we weren't tracking either. Like none of us were tracking with what Jesus says, even though he had just dropped this massive truth bomb on us, and we should have seen it. We were blind. Like, this is John's way of saying, and guess what? We were laughing at the Pharisees for being blind, but we were just as blind with them because Jesus was saying things like this, and we had no idea what he was saying. No idea at all. But when you recognize that Jesus, exactly what he says over and over again in all the Gospels, that he's not coming to replace the Bible of Israel. He's coming to fulfill it. It makes... Like suddenly you start thinking of it that way and start taking everything Jesus says and saying, how is what he's saying about himself and why he's now here with us a fulfillment of everything that we know from our Bible? And so then you start thinking of, well, he's talking about shepherds and sheep. Are there any places in the Hebrew Bible where shepherds or sheep come up at all? Can you think of even one verse? Psalm 23, like that's the most basic, like my children when they were 3 years old, they knew at least that, the Lord is my shepherd, right? But beyond that, are there a few verses? How many verses do you think we could find that have talk about shepherds or sheep, in general? Hundreds, it's all over the place, right? Because this part of the world, that's their lifestyle. And guess what? To this day, in that part of the world, it's still their lifestyle. I remember it was so surreal for me. It was either my first or second time in Antioch. And we were kind of up in the, Antioch is kind of in this valley, at least it is today, and there's kind of these mountains that surround it. And we're kind of up in the mountains, and we were going up there. We're going to just to see the whole city and pray over the city and all of that. And we'd hiked and hiked and hiked, and I was worn out, and I'm just like, man, I've climbed all this way, and you have to be in really good shape to get up here. I was feeling kind of proud of myself. And then before I know it, here comes just right up what looked like a cliff. I came up through this path and switchbacked my way up. But straight up this cliff, it seemed like here comes this guy who looks like he's in his late 70s with a walking staff and he's calling his sheep, and his sheep are following him up the steep slope, and he's just taking them up the mountainside to the other side where he was going to graze them. And it was just something right out of this time period. I mean, the way he was dressed and how he looked and his beard and his staff and everything. I mean, yeah, it's this 2,000 years later, that area of the world, they still do that. And, when you talk about, shepherds, often, here in the West, and most people have never been around shepherds or shepherding or flocks or anything like that. I think the closest most people have in their imaginations is the American cowboy, which actually isn't a bad thing. And I'll tell you why. Because like usually when people think of shepherds, because we generally think of shepherds just from Bible stories, like that's been my experience, even people who aren't really believers, but maybe they're around church culture, they have Bible stories, and they have guys in long dresses and sweet beards, and they're smiling, and they have little staff, and they seem all cuddly, like a Santa Claus, like Middle Eastern Santa Claus or something. And they're these cute, cuddly people, the shepherds. But really, shepherds are like that guy I just saw, and like the American cowboy. To be a shepherd, like it was a manly profession. Like it was rough, it was tiring, it was hard work, it was dangerous. Like it wasn't like anybody could just go, I'll be a shepherd, whatever. Like it was a hard thing to do. And when Jesus talks about himself and comparing himself to a shepherd, he's connecting himself to a metaphor that God had used in their Bible over and over again for how he wanted to relate to his people Israel. Just as the shepherd, was guardian over and watched over and saw to the basic needs of the sheep. Because we didn't own sheep when I lived in Saudi Arabia, but my grandparents they were wealthy, so they had flocks and things like that they owned. And I was around sheep and goats enough to know that they're probably some of the most stupid animals on the earth. Right above camels, but still really low on the intelligence scale. And like you have to lead them and bring them to where their water is and where their food is, and they get lost. I mean, they're just the most helpless animals. You don't generally run into huge flocks of sheep or goats in the wild, like big flocks, for a reason. Like they just get themselves killed like crazy. But when you have a shepherd taking care of their needs and watching over them, then suddenly the flock can produce and reproduce and become quite large. But that you only have that scenario when you have a good, skilled shepherd caring for and watching for the basic day-to-day needs of the sheep. And so God seized on this metaphor that the people of the region were quite familiar with and says, that's the kind of relationship you got to see yourselves. I know you think you've got all your stuff together and that you don't need me as your creator and all that. You can just live your life. But you're just as foolish and short-sighted and forgetful, helpless as these sheep that you see and make fun of every day. Without me, you're just like that. You're food for the wolves. You get lost and go astray so easy. You can drink at the same place every day, and then the next day forget where the water was and go and drink in the wrong place and go to the wrong direction. All of that. You need me to protect you and watch over you, and you need to accept that and receive that with praise and not reject me and turn away from me. And so when Jesus is talking about this, and specifically talking about this idea of thieves and robbers and people trying to get at the sheep, and this idea of the sheep will hear his voice and follow him, and when he's talking about that, so how the kind of scenario that Jesus is talking about here is one where there's like a community sheepfold, several different shepherds all keep their flocks, because it's, you know what the purpose of the sheepfold is? The sheepfold is where the sheep are protected. There's a wall or there's some kind of natural barrier that surrounds them so that the wolves, the bears, bad actors that want to get at the sheep, it keeps them away. The sheep are secure. They can't run off. They can't wander away. It keeps them contained, and it keeps them safe. But they'll eat every blade of grass in that sheepfold. There won't be any food for them there for very long. And so then periodically you've got to take them out. You might be able to bring them water to their sheepfold, but you got to take them out to get them food and let them graze, and then you bring them back in. And so rather than build multiple sheepfolds in an area, if there's a lot of people that have flocks in that area, they'll all share a single sheepfold. And what they'll do is then when they go, they'll have someone who's usually a hired person to watch the gate, make sure nobody's just going in there and pulling sheep out. But they'll open the gate, and when the shepherds call their sheep know their voice. And it seems like such a weird thing. These animals are so dumb, but they remember from the time they're born through their whole life, they know that voice of the shepherd. And I witnessed it there on the slopes of Habib an-Najjar Mountain, just outside of Antioch. Like he's just constantly singing to them and speaking to them like just the whole day long. They hear his voice over and over, and they associate his voice with safety. Oh, the sound that leads me to water. Oh, the sound that leads me to my grazing pasture. Oh, it's this voice that leads me to life. That's what the voice of the shepherd is. And so when someone else, and each flock knows the unique voice of their shepherd. And so they don't have to go in and like look for who's got the right sheep ear tags and all that, like what we do today, here in the U.S. with cows and sheep and things like that. They could just listen for the voice, and then they're boom. And the sheep that don't belong to that shepherd, they're not leaving that fold. They don't know that guy. They don't know that voice. They don't know what that voice leads to. That could be a voice that leads to death. They're listening for the voice that they know leads to life. That's the voice of their shepherd. So Jesus is such a beautiful, right? It's such a beautiful picture, perfect picture of our relationship with God. And so in so many places in the prophets, God uses this metaphor of himself. And like the big one that I think Jesus is activating here is Ezekiel 34. And we won't read that. That's like your homework. Like go back later this week, read Ezekiel 34. Actually read it 34 all the way to 37. That's a really amazing thing. And then go back and read John 10 again and just see like, whoa, all the connections that you can make. But instead I'm going to throw out just a few of the smaller connections that I think Jesus is activating with this shepherd imagery, and with the idea that there are people that want to play shepherd. There are people that want to take the sheep, but they don't have good intentions for the sheep. So one of them is Isaiah 56. So listen to Isaiah 56. This is 9 through 12. And just listen to this and imagine, picture this as the Lord speaking. He says, "All you beasts of the field come to devour, all you beasts in the forest. His watchmen are blind. They are all without knowledge. They are all silent dogs. They cannot bark, dreaming, lying down, loving to slumber. The dogs have a mighty appetite. They never have enough. But they are shepherds who have no understanding. They have all turned to their own way, each to his own gain, one and all. Come, they say, let me get wine. Let us fill ourselves with strong drink. And tomorrow will be like this day, great beyond measure." And I love what you can do in a poem, and that's why I think a third of the Bible is written as poetry, because poems, just what they can do in your imagination and your heart. You see what the poet did there in Isaiah. He started with an imagery of beasts of the field, like you think like wolves or lions or tigers or bears, oh my, that kind of an imagery. And then slowly through the language, you don't even suddenly it's not talking about these beasts of the field that want to devour the sheep are actually shepherds. But they're not good shepherds, right? They want to take advantage of the sheep. They want to exploit the sheep. They want to fill their bellies. They want to relax and get drunk off the wine, and they think that this is just this good time is going to continue on forever. And another good passage here is Jeremiah 32, which just follows right after. So Jeremiah 32. So let's pick up. Oh wait, no, not 32. '23. I think that's right. Yes. My dyslexia. I knew 3 and 2 were in there. I was like, that's not right at all. No, it's the righteous branch. That's what I was looking for. Yeah, so it's Jeremiah 23, sorry. "Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who care for my people. You have scattered my flock and driven them away, and you've not attended to them. Behold, I will attend to you, for your evil deeds, declares the Lord. Then I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. I will set shepherds over them who will care for them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall there be any missing, declares the Lord. And so again, you have this picture of that Israel had shepherds over them. They had people. They had both the monarchy, if they were in Judea, the monarchy, the line of David, that was supposed to be ruling over them with justice and righteousness. And then they had, the priesthood. They're supposed to be representing them before the God of Israel and leading the people. And yet, both of these groups were just so fatally flawed. And so many of them abuse. I mean, it's not hard to see why, right? Even people that might start off with good intentions, you give them a bunch of authority and a bunch of power, both political and religious. What's going to happen every time? Can you think of any human institution, government, religious organization that once they're given power, real power and authority over the people, didn't immediately start using that for their own personal gain, to exploit the system, right? We see it seems like every single week we read about another, even in the church, some Christian leader had authority and power and fame and money and all of this, and then what happens? There's a big fall. And we think, how does that happen, right? We don't do well with that stuff because of our sinful nature. And God is saying, I see that. I see what's happening. I see what people are doing in my name, these shepherds of Israel. And God isn't just saying, hey, keep waiting for people to get better, be patient. God's saying, I'm going to step into this story. I'm going to step in. I'm going to bring my people back. I'm going to take care of them. That's why I say, read Ezekiel 34, my goodness. All the things that the Lord says, I'm going to show up and do this thing. The God of Israel is the ultimate shepherd of Israel. And then one last little thing before we move on. So, I think we'll see. Could be. Yeah, I didn't write down where the passage is, but so you have to look this up, and don't trust that. Don't trust me just because I tell you it's in the Bible. Go look it up later and verify that it's in the Bible. But there's a prayer from Moses, the intercessor of Israel, where he's praying for the people as usual, and he's asking the Lord, give them a shepherd who will go before the people and will go in and out before the people. There's this in and out language that Jesus is about to use in this passage in John 10. And it's mirrored in this prayer of Moses. And then right after Moses prays that, then the next verse is, and then God said, yeah, go and lay hands on Joshua. He's going to be the guy. Now, what do Joshua and Jesus have in common? They have the same name, right? And so there's this beautiful picture, Moses prays this prayer, and there's an immediate physical representative and a physical reality and answer to that prayer in the moment, in the time of Moses. But then there's this beautiful picture of the future Joshua who will be the ultimate shepherd to go in and out before the people and lead them both to safety and into life, into their food and drink. So anyway, okay. So, and this is just, I could go all night and just find all these shepherd passages that totally connect with this, right? But he says this, they don't get it. So verse 7, Jesus says again to them. So this is how Jesus rolls. He'll say something, they don't get it. He's not just saying it again. What he says next in this passage is him, yes, reiterating some of the same ideas, but actually expanding it, taking it out, stretching it out even further. He's actually saying even more. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. Which is just, I thought that's really funny. He's saying that he's the shepherd, right? And they don't get it. So he's like, I'm the door. Do you get that? Like, does that make more sense to you? And I'm sure they're thinking, no, it doesn't. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. This is, I think, he is connecting and all of those stories, both in the past, in the time of Jeremiah and Isaiah and the other prophets, that those passages that I just read are linking with, but also with the present day religious leaders. Like, let's not think that he's only referring to things that happened hundreds of years before. What just happened in the story? Just happened in the story. You have an Israelite who's healing glorified God as he was cured of blindness from birth, and the people are supposed to be the religious leaders. He's taken to them, and they end up casting him out. They cast him out of the synagogue because ultimately he was healed, and he wouldn't bad talk the person that healed them to go along with their political agenda, and they cast him out. And by the way, did you notice in that Isaiah passage, the bad shepherds, the ones that are compared to beasts, it also says of them that they're blind. And what did Jesus just say to these Pharisees? That you're blind, right? And you see like all these things, all these connections are like coming together. So he says, okay, verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pastures. That in and out language from Moses' prayer. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. And if you're thinking, but wait a minute, Jesus, I thought you were the door. Are you the door or are you the shepherd? And Jesus is saying, yes. Yes, the answer is yes. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He's making a distinction. What's the difference between Jesus? Why should we trust Jesus versus all of these other religious leaders? And not just, in our present day, but, you look back at all of human history. There's been many people in the world who have risen up and said, I know what the meaning of life is. I know why we're here. I know how we ought to live. Follow me. Some of them came with their own book. Some of them didn't have a book, whatever. But they all said, I have it. Follow me. I'm a shepherd you can trust. And we as sheep hearing these voices, how do we know which is the voice that's going to lead me to life versus all the voices that are the voices of thieves and killers and destroyers who ultimately want to exploit us and lead us to death? And Jesus says, this is how you know. The good shepherd is the one that dies for you. He's the one that dies for you. And there's a lot of people in the world and human history that said a lot of really good sounding things and tried to gain followings, but none of them, and they all died. They all died. They have that in common. But none of them can say that they died to save the people. But Jesus says that's the mark of the good shepherd. He says who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them, which makes perfect sense, right? Because the difference between a hired hand and a shepherd is if you own, I don't know, like what your job might be. So let's say you work in a bakery. If you're a worker, you're an employee at Panera, right? You're probably not there because you just love bread and you love baking bread. And honestly, if they didn't pay me, I'd still come up here every single day to make this bread because I love making bread, right? No, you're there. Maybe you'd like some of those things, but ultimately you're there to get a paycheck so you can go home and buy your own bread, right? And pay your bills and all of that. Like when you have a job to do and you're being paid for it, ultimately the reason you're doing the job, the ultimate reason, you might enjoy the job, you might not, but you're doing it for the paycheck. The shepherd, he owns the sheep. The sheep are his, and they're his treasure, they're his wealth, they're his inheritance that he would leave his family. Sorry, that door's closed, or it's locked on that side. Sorry. So if you're a shepherd and your whole livelihood is tied up in the sheep, and the sheep get killed and stolen and destroyed, like you have nothing, like you just lost everything you own. That's all you have. And so you're going to fight tooth and nail to protect it because they're yours. They're yours. They're your treasure and your inheritance. And so Jesus is saying that's kind of like what it's like for me. There's other people who might be taking care of you, but ultimately they're doing it for what they're going to get out of it. They're going to get some kind of a paycheck, or they're going to get something out of it. But he's saying that I'm not like that. I'm tied up. My life is tied up in you. And in your safety, and in your being taken care of, and you being fed. He says, I'm the good shepherd in verse 14. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. So, how well does Jesus know the Father? Is there anything about the Father that Jesus doesn't know? Is there anything about Jesus that the Father doesn't know? Like, how well does the Father know the Son? Right? And Jesus is saying, that's how I know my sheep. Jesus is saying, and I know everything about you. Everything about you. And I'm ready to lay my life down for you. Wow. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also. And they're going to listen to my voice. And who's he talking about there? So, Gentiles is one option. Another option is he's talking about the scattered tribes of Israel that are out there in the diaspora, scattered in the Gentile nations. I think it's both and, not either or. I think he is talking about, because if he's going to fulfill the promises of the prophets, he's got to bring in, right, all those who've been scattered out into the nations. It's that second Exodus. It's that the Messiah is to come and bring back and restore, Israel, and bring Israel back. Except when he's bringing them back, he's also bringing all the nations along to a new Israel 2.0 that doesn't exclude those who came before, but includes those who were on the outside before. He's going to bring them all together under one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. And this is something that if you haven't caught on yet, and we're going to see it again here in a few minutes, but over and over again in John, there's this pattern of Jesus says something really provocative. It pushes people. Eventually, people are pushed enough that they're ready to kill him, regardless of the consequences for themselves, because it's not legal for them to just kill people. Mob justice wasn't allowed in the Roman Empire in their conquered territories. But they got that upset. And you keep seeing this phrase over and over again. And Jesus slipped away from them. And Jesus, Jesus suddenly wasn't there. Like he just... And what John is trying to make the point, and what Jesus is saying here, is that when they finally get him at the end, towards the end of this story, it's not because Jesus ran out of escape routes or couldn't slip away or got pinned down and, had to give up and surrender. No. He had the authority, like he could have kept slipping through their fingers as long as he wanted to. He submitted to the Father's will and allowed himself to be taken when we get to that part of the story. And until then, they weren't going to kill him prematurely. They weren't going to be allowed to stone him before he found his way to the cross. And Jesus is saying that I have that authority to lay down my life and take it. Nobody gets to take my life from me. He says, this charge I have received from my Father. So he says this. And remember, this is Jesus's, because you didn't get the first figure of speech. So then Jesus says all that to clear it up for you. So you're clear now, right? And there was again division among the Jews because of these words. Many of them said, he has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him? And these two things, he has a demon and it's not mutually exclusive. Like these things go hand in hand. If someone who was demonized often behaved in a manner that people would see was insane, not logical, all of that. So they're saying, okay, he's just spouting nonsense. Like this, what he's saying makes no sense at all. He's clearly demonized. That's what people are saying. Others said, these are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of a blind man? Because we just had that blind man whose eyes were opened, and they're still talking about that. That we can't ignore that. We can't, that's a big deal. No one's ever done that before. How could a demon show up, possess this guy, and do something like that? It doesn't make any sense, but they're not getting what he's saying, right? And so that's when John tells us, and at that time, it was the Feast of Dedication and took place at Jerusalem, and it was winter. And Jesus is walking by the house. It's like, we just goes, boom, like, wait, what? You went right from that, and now suddenly it's Hanukkah, Feast of Dedication. So what's Hanukkah? So, short version. Who here has ever read 1st and 2nd Maccabees? Who's heard of 1st and 2nd Maccabees? Parts, yes, at least heard of it. So they're not in our Bible, but that doesn't mean they're not good reading material. And if you want to get really good insight into the struggles and the challenges and the victories and defeats of Israel right before the time of Christ, like go and read it. It'll like help you to understand like what was going through people's hearts and minds, trying to make sense of the crazy, crazy times they were in, and the kinds of like existential threats that were coming down on Israel right and left, and how insane it was that Judaism even survived, and what a miracle for them to even last until their Messiah was born. Like, was a miracle. And the 1st and 2nd Maccabees will give you some insight into that. And there's some really profound things that the writer or writers of those scrolls put in there. There's some musing about trying to make sense of all the martyrs that came out of that time, and why God was allowing, it seemed like the most righteous and blameless people among the Israelites were the ones getting nailed, just getting killed left and right. And at one point, one of the writers says, could it be that maybe if enough blood was shed, righteous blood, it would be enough to cover over the sins of Israel, and God would like welcome us back and return to us, and all that. You could tell they were already starting to think along those terms even before Jesus. So here's what was going on. So about 160 years before Jesus was born, you have this Syrian king comes down, Antiochus Epiphanes, and he conquers the region. He doesn't like Judaism. He wants to wipe Judaism off the face of the map. And so he comes in he realizes really quick that Judaism revolves around the temple. Like everything important in Judaism happens in the temple or pointed to the temple or interacts with the temple in some way. And so I'm just going to mess that thing up so bad that they won't be able to do that anymore. And so they desecrate the temple. He builds his own pagan altar in the courtyard, and they're sacrificing pigs, and it's covering everything in pig's blood. And then they make it illegal to own even a scrap of the Torah is punishable by death. I mean, they just make everything to do with Judaism and being, a Torah observant Jew, like totally illegal. And this guy, Judas Maccabeus, or Judas the Hammer, and his brothers rise up and they fight back and they beat the pants off these guys. And they go in and they rededicate, they cleanse the temple completely, and they rededicate it again for the worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And it's this beautiful story, and they have this great feast that, technically, they only have the feast that Moses gave them in the Torah, but they kind of tack on Hanukkah like it's like a second Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. Like this, it's like Tabernacles in December. It's like, and even in the book of Maccabees, they say that like this is like Tabernacles in December, not December, but the month that'd be the Jewish month, which is the last month of the year, and so that's why Hanukkah carries over some of the symbolism from Tabernacles, and it's called the Feast of Dedication, also the Feast of Lights, right? And people, remember that, and the rededication of the temple, and one of the key differences between Hanukkah and Tabernacles, as they said, because it's not one of the feasts that Moses gave us. It's not mandatory that you come to Jerusalem. You can, and it's what better place to celebrate it, but you can celebrate it in your homes and wherever you are and all of that. And so that gives you just a little bit of background on what that is. And so John is telling us that it's Hanukkah time for a reason. This isn't just like a random journalistic footnote. Jesus is about to do something very Hanukkah-like. And so let's see what that is. So it's winter. Jesus is walking in the temple. And look at that. It's the colonnade of Solomon. Remember, I told you, watch out for colonnades. So this section began in colonnades and it ends in colonnades. Just like this section began in Cana and it ended in Cana. Yeah. That's just like our little literary clue that he's wrapping up another big section, and so we are to expect, since right after that we had a healing from death, we're going to have another kind of healing from death event parallel to that right after this, and sure enough, that's John 11. So he's walking in the colonnade of Solomon, which, if you've read Acts, this is a favorite hangout for the Christians later. The Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense?" And another way to read that in Greek, "How long will you continue to annoy us?" I'm serious. That's another way you can legitimately read it in Greek. Now, which way they meant it, you kind of have to figure it out from the context. It's the first thing they say, so we have to keep reading to figure out which way they mean it. Do they mean it in a more, sincere way, or are they being aggressive with him, right? If you're the Christ, if you are Messiah, tell us plainly. Just say it, guy. I mean, come on. So I think they mean it the other way. I think they're getting frustrated. And honestly, I think there's insincerity. The reason why they want him to declare himself Messiah, because if they can just get him to say that, then they can arrest him, right? Because then they can turn him right over to the Romans. Because the Jews know to claim to be Messiah means you're claiming to be the King of Israel, the Son of David. And Rome won't allow another king. They won't allow a competitor with Caesar. So if they can get him to just say it publicly, they can be done. Let him be the Romans' problem. And I think that's why they're just so frustrated that in their mind, he's just dancing around it and won't just say it plainly. And Jesus answered them, "I told you. And you don't believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe because you're not among my sheep." And remember, when he says, this is the third time now that Jesus has called to the witness stand the works of my Father that I do. And remember, that's Jesus basically saying, I do things that only God can do. What more information do you need? That's what he's saying. He's like, if you're paying attention to my life, if you're really watching me and listening to everything I say and watching everything I do, you should be clued in by now that I only do things that God does. So what more information do you need? But you don't believe. You don't believe. You see me doing God things, but you cannot possibly imagine that I could be the God of Israel come. The great shepherd of Israel come to gather his sheep because, you're not my sheep. The shepherd of Israel has come, and there are some Israelites that are not his sheep. How hard would that be to receive and hear? If you had ears to hear what he was saying in that moment, right? He says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. And then we're told the Jews picks up stones to stone him. And why do they immediately want to stone him when he says that? He's blaspheming. How is he blaspheming? I and the Father are one. I don't know. I don't think Jesus was speaking to them in Greek. John is narrating us this story in Greek. I'm trying to imagine if Jesus was speaking Aramaic or Hebrew. And if he's speaking either one, if he said, I and the Father are echad or ahad. And if you're a devout Jew in Jerusalem, you know that word because it appears in the end of the very first sentence of the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, right? Shema Yisrael, Eloheinu Yahweh, Eloheinu Echad. Is the Lord your God is our God is one, And Jesus is saying, Hear, O Israel, I and the Father are one. He just put himself in the Shema. You see why they're immediately they know they can get crucified for stoning him if they get caught. I mean, they can, they'll get Roman justice for, being, for murder, for killing him. But they immediately, they are so enraged at what he's saying because they get what he's saying. They pick up stones to stone him, and then Jesus answers them with one of the most sarcastic things ever to come out of the mouth of Jesus in the Bible. I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? Like for once, Jesus could have, Jesus his way out of that situation. Like he had so many times before when they picked up, usually you see pick up stones to stone him, but Jesus eluded them. He slipped out among them and they're like, wait, where did he go? And he was gone. He puts up his hood and he looks like any other pilgrim and, he vanishes, into the crowd, right? But this time he stays behind. And I really believe, just because I feel like we saw that in John 5, the heart of Jesus for these people that are his accusers, is he's pleading with them. Like he doesn't want it to end this way for them. They're not his sheep and they're not hearing and recognizing his voice, but he wishes it weren't so. And he's given them one more chance to think, stop. I know we're all Middle Easterners and we get really hot-tempered and we want to act and throw things at people so fast. But just calm down, take a breath for just a moment. Think this through. I've been showing you beautiful works from the Father. I have done glorious things that only God can do. And I've been doing them right in your midst. And your reaction is you're going to stone me to death? Think about what you're doing. And they answer him, it is not for a good work that we're going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. They got it. They understood what he was saying. And so Jesus answered them with something that has puzzled theologians for over 1,000 years. And I want to make this really clear. This is Jesus' defense on why he gets to equate himself with the God of Israel. This is his defense. He says, is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be broken, do you not say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? I'm not doing the works of my Father. If I'm not doing the works of my Father, then don't believe me. But if I do them, even though you don't believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I'm in the Father. And then they sought to arrest him, but he escaped. He gave him one more chance. And a lot of people read that and they scratch their heads. What is he talking about? In the law, I said you're gods, plural. There's somewhere in the law that says there's gods. Thought we're supposed to be following a monotheistic religion here. What's going on? Right? It's so really puzzling. Fortunately, in the Greek there, John has recorded it as literally a word-for-word quotation from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, and it's from Psalm 82. Psalm 82. How many of you are familiar with Psalm 82? There's a couple Bible nerds in the house. Yeah. And it's not a super long psalm. It's a very puzzling psalm if you don't understand the background of it, but it's not a very long one. So I'll just read it really quick. So this is Psalm 82, a psalm of Asaph. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So this is what he says. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. And then the psalmist says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. Clear as mud? This is of all the places in the Hebrew Bible he could go to justify his claim that I and the Father are one, and then afterwards say, don't you see now that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? Because I quoted this psalm, so you guys would get it. And you're probably thinking, and what is this psalm? If there's gods, and who's God talking to, and what? And if you read it in the Hebrew and you're not prepared for this, it's even more unsettling. Because, it says the Hebrew word that usually gets translated as God in our English translations is Elohim. And it's actually a plural word in Hebrew. It's kind of interesting. The word for God, singular, is a plural word. But it can also mean gods, plural, when it's talking about anyone but the God of Israel. And so it literally says in Psalm 82, Elohim has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the Elohim, he holds judgment. It's the same exact word. Same exact word. What in the world is the psalmist singing about here? And what is this? What's going on? So, and what is the divine council, right? So there's like no time at all to go deep into this. But this is where I'm going to plug some great stuff that some of my friends are doing called the Bible Project. They have a whole series on the divine council and spiritual beings. They're quick, short, like 5-minute videos on all of this stuff with lots of Bible references. And they got lots of like blog posts and podcasts associated with you to go deeper and all of that. But so here's the summation. You're going to be like, this is going to give you more questions. I'm sorry. But go and do some research this week if you're curious and come back with your questions next week. But there's a story that doesn't get preached a lot on Sunday mornings in church, but it is in the Hebrew Bible, and specifically in the Torah, we have a shattering of humanity that happens at the Tower of Babel. People are all gathered together as kind of basically one nation and one people with one language, but they're just bent on using it for their own, making their own name and reshaping their own identity and all that. God comes down, confuses their languages at Babel, scatters the people off in different directions, and you have all these different nations, 70 nations that come out of that event in Genesis 11. And then there's some commentary about that happens in Deuteronomy 32, where God is talking to Moses about that event and how, when the peoples all were scattered off, they had said to God very clearly in the building of that tower, we don't want you to be our God, God who made us. Like, we reject you. We don't want you as our God anymore. And God says, you know what I did? I said, fine, I won't be your God anymore. I'll put you under the authority of some of the members of my divine council, the sons of God, is what they're called in the Hebrew Bible. And they'll have authority over you. Each nation will get one. And it actually says that he numbered the nations at that time according to the number of the sons of God and sent them off. And like, okay, you'll come to me through them now instead of coming to me directly because you don't like me apparently. But he said, but Israel, I chose you as my portion. You're my people. I made you from nothing, from an old man and woman who were way too old to be having a family. I caused a miracle, and you are a people that are a miracle people, and you don't belong to those sons of God, those spiritual authorities that are in the world. You belong only to me, and you will only come to me, and you will only offer sacrifice and worship to me, and not these other powers that are in the world. Well, what happened is, and what the psalmist is singing about, is these powers that are over the nations. What the psalmist is saying, when God put these rulers and authorities in the heavenly places over the nations, each nation had one, they were supposed to do what the psalmist says, like look after the needy and the afflicted, lead them towards light and truth. They were supposed to be pointing the nations towards God, while the nations were waiting for God to produce the salvation and the light of all the nations through Israel. And instead, what did these powers do? They became drunk with the authority and power that they had and began to act like they were gods unto themselves and powers unto themselves, and to receive the worship that was meant for the Most High. And the psalmist is saying, oh, guess what, powers that be? One day, the Lord of the divine council, the God of gods, the Elohim of Elohim, is going to judge you, and your immortality, your power, your authority is going to be stripped from you, and you're going to die like any mortal man. And when that happens, that's why the psalm ends with, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. It's an eschatological psalm. It's saying, it's looking forward to the day when God is going to take back what is rightfully his. He allowed the nations to go under these beings, but now he's taking them back, and their authority and power is revoked. And so, okay, again, why is Jesus quoting this psalm? Because he's saying to these scribes and Pharisees, people who know their Bibles, some of this might be new information for you tonight, and I'm sorry. Like I said, I encourage you to go research this stuff yourself, learn about it. But it wasn't new information for them. They understood this. They had a category for spiritual beings that God himself referred to in the plural as Elohim. And they had no problem with that. They understood that there were spiritual powers and authorities and principalities in the world, and that God himself used the word Elohim to describe them. And he's saying, you have a category for that, and you have no problem with that. And yet here I am among you, and saying that I and the Father are one, that there's a special category for me. And you just can't even imagine, you can't even fathom that the God of Israel might actually be standing here right now, right in front of you. And they're just like, they got what he was saying. That's why they, when he says all that, they then again try to grab him. They've cooled down enough to try to arrest him instead of stone him this time. But they get what he's saying. They get that he is equating himself. Jesus isn't saying, oh, I'm one of the sons of God, like these powers that they were familiar with. He says, no, I'm the Son of God. I am. And when he says the Father is in me and I'm in the Father, he's also equating himself with this really interesting, mysterious figure that pops up all through the Hebrew Bible called the angel of the Lord, that when God is speaking to Moses says, hey, yeah, I'm putting my name in him. And so when he's there and talking to you, you better treat him well and listen to everything he says, because when he's talking to you, it's the same as when I'm talking to you. And when you're in his presence, it's the same as when you're in my presence. And this figure shows up all throughout, everywhere. And it looks like an angel, except it's distinct from every other angel in the Bible. And when it speaks like it's God speaking. And so I feel like Jesus is trying to beg them to think back and realize that they already have a category for how God is able to be here right now in the form of a man. If they had the idea that when these angelic beings were gathering as a council, that somehow God was in the midst of them, and yet that same God was able to come in some sort of angelic form in the past and relate to Israel, and that we're okay with that, and they're okay with understanding that that's somehow God and distinct from God at the same time. And Jesus is saying, yeah, and that's what I am. That's how I can say that I and the Father are one. And I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me. But I'm not the Father, and the Father's not me. But the Father's God, and I'm God. And it's yeah. And so, and by the way, these are great passages for talking about the Trinity, because this is as close as we can get to having language that we didn't make up on our own to talk about it. And if it's still confusing and mysterious, that's okay. That's okay, because this is Jesus trying to explain the Trinity to us. And this is, this is the best we're going to get, this side of his return. So he went again. This section ends with, he went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first. So we're all the way back to where we started in this section here, right around the prologue, in the region of Bethniah. And many came to him, and they said, John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true. And many believed in him there. And so this section, John wraps it up with this sweet and happy note, this like little word of encouragement, because it's so frustrating, right? Here are the leaders, the Bible teachers of Israel, and they're not getting it. And you're just thinking, who could possibly get it? Where are Jesus' sheep? Who will come to him? Who will anyone believe? This is not the story we imagined when we imagined Israel's Messiah coming to her, coming to his bride, and it's just like nobody gets it, right? But then we have this short little paragraph. Then Jesus went back to this region, where John had been baptized. John's dead at this point. He's dead at this point in the story. He's already lost his life. And yet his witness remained. And people remembered his witness. They remembered his testimony. And then when they saw Jesus again, they said, wait a second. This is the guy that John talked about. And everything that John didn't do any miracles, but he gave a faithful and accurate witness of Jesus. And now that I see him, I see that everything John said about him was true and more. I want to follow him. I want to believe in him. And that is, I think, John's way of turning the story, because in case we're starting to relate a little bit to Jesus when we talk with our family, when we talk with our coworkers, when we talk with our neighbors, and we're just like, they're just blind and they can't see it, and what do I do? Do I just decide they're predestined for hell and give up? No. Right? We remember that we don't have to do signs and wonders and miracles for people to believe in Jesus. We have to follow the example of John the Baptist and preach Jesus with all of our heart, soul, and strength, what he has done for us, how he has rescued us and saved us. And invite people to come and see and meet Jesus for themselves and see that everything that we have said about him, everything that I have said about him is absolutely true and more. That his voice, his words are the voice and words of life. So that's where we'll end that. So let's pray.